The land cover in this map is described with surface textures. In this video I'll show you how to use pattern fills to create textures like this, and also how to use pattern brushes to make a textured stroke that repeats itself over the length of a path. So over in this document, I've got this air photo that's a little bit desaturated so that we can draw on top of it. And to start with, I'm just going to make a new layer and call it crops. And I like to make an area that describes the shape of this field and then apply a pattern texture to it. So my first step is going to be to get the pen tool and just start tracing the outside of this field. And just so I can draw it easier, I'll switch this fill and the stroke. Now I need to get a texture in order to put in there, and Illustrator comes with a variety of textures that can be useful. If you go over to the swatches panel, what we're looking for are something called pattern swatches. So if we go to this little drop-down menu in the upper right-hand corner of the swatches panel, go down to Open Swatch Library, and then down to Patterns, and then to Basic Graphics. Then we have basic graphics in dots, lines, and textures. And I'm going to go ahead and, in succession here, open up all three. So we'll start with dots. There's our panel for dots. I'll do this again. To that menu in the upper right-hand corner, Open Swatch Library, Patterns, Basic Graphics, and now Basic Graphics Lines. I'll pull that out so we can see both of them at the same time. And then this third one, Open Swatch Library, Patterns, Basic Graphics, Textures. And I'll put that one down as well. So you can see that here we've got some sort of stippling textures that we can use. Here are parallel line textures, so hatching. And then here we have some more complex textures, including actually some textures for making maps. Here's a USGS texture for land inundation. So if we have our area selected here, I'll just grab it with the selection tool so the whole thing is selected. We can go ahead, as long as our fill swatch here is at the top, so we know that we're giving this area some fill, we can go ahead and just select one of these textures, and you'll see that it will populate that area with the texture, and there are all these different sort of scales of different dots. We can do lines as well, different types of line textures, and then there are also these pattern textures. So here we have one for swamp. There's some sort of intricate surface, that's a geologic texture. Here's one for an intermittent pond, but you don't have to use them for the specific things that they're labeled for. And I think that some of these sand textures are actually some of the best, just because they seem kind of natural. They have some variation to them. So with all of these textures, it's pretty evident that they're too large. The scale is inappropriate for the size of this area. And we can pretty easily change that. If we have our object selected and we come over to the scale tool and double click on it, then there's an option in here. I'll hit the preview button so you can see what it's going to do. There's an option in here to scale objects or patterns or both, and we don't want to scale the object because we don't want to make this area smaller. We just want to make the pattern inside of the area smaller. So I'll uncheck objects, we'll leave patterns checked, and then if I change that scale to say 20%, then it will scale the pattern so that it's 20% of that size. Maybe 20% was slightly too small. 50% looks pretty good. We'll stick with that. Okay, and you can do the same thing with lines, for instance. So if we were to come here and grab our pen tool and make another area, it's using that texture that we had before because it was already it was the swatch that was being used for our fill. But we can go ahead and change that. We'll select the whole area and grab this sort of line texture, and it's applied at the same scale because that's what we had set from before. We could change that scale if we wanted to. We could also change the rotation. With the rotate tool here, if we double click on that, we pull up a dialog And again, you have the option to rotate the object or the pattern, and we just want to do the pattern. And we could change that to 45 degrees if we wanted to, and then it would rotate the pattern so that we had sort of a cross hatching. Another handy thing is that you can select the angle, say 45 in this case, and then use the up and down arrows on your keyboard in order to nudge that angle. So say that we were trying to get these lines to run perfectly up and down our field, rather than guessing at that rotation value, which is somewhere around 82 degrees, we can just nudge our rotation up and down until we get there. The other thing you can do is edit these pattern swatches. And so say that we had we liked this line swatch, but we wanted the lines to be slightly thinner. The best way of going about that is to edit the swatch that Illustrator has already made for us. It's kind of difficult to produce your own pattern swatches from scratch, but it's fairly easy to edit them because the template has already been set up for you. So I'm going to come over to this swatch that's in the Basic Graphics Lines panel here, and just click and drag it out onto the surface of our map, and you'll see that in this layer we now have this group, which is essentially a square with a bunch of lines in it, and and then it also has these two lines out here. They don't need to be there. They won't actually contribute to the pattern swatch. I think they're just a sample of that texture, and in fact we may just go ahead and delete them. But what's being used in order to make the texture are these lines that are inside of the square, and a square is always the sort of basic tile unit for creating a texture. So to edit this, I'm just going to double click on it. So we'll go into an isolation mode on this group. If I then go ahead and select, I'm just going to make a rectangular selection here around all of those lines. Then come over here to the stroke. I think we actually got more than we wanted to. There's all these paths, and then there's this square here that defines the area that is going to be tiled in our pattern, and that doesn't have any fill or stroke, so we want to avoid selecting that. So I'll try my selection again here and try to get it just inside that square. Great, we didn't get it. So right now those lines have a stroke weight of 0.72. I'll change that to 0.25, just a bit thinner. You can see that they look a bit thinner on the screen. And if I go back out of my isolation mode to the regular map, here's my group that defined that swatch. And to make that into a pattern, all I need to do is open up the symbols panel, or the swatches panel up here, excuse me, and drag that group onto the swatches panel. And you can see it made a new pattern swatch right there. It called it new pattern swatch 1. If you wanted to, you could come and double click on that and change the name of the pattern swatch, but I won't worry about that right now. We'll delete that group that we made the swatch out of, and then we can just come select that area and apply that new pattern swatch, which has slightly thinner lines. So I also want to teach you how to make something called pattern brushes, which allow you to repeat a pattern such as this hash mark along a line that I've drawn. If I come over here to crops, unlock that, and I can just show you that this is a path that I've made, and I've made this hash mark that will then be repeated along that. Come back over to my example here. All I need to do in order to make a pattern brush is come over here with the pen tool and draw a hatch mark that I would like to be repeated. It's got a stroke of 1, that's just fine with me. It's really easy to create a pattern brush. All you need to do is open the brushes panel, which is right here, and drag that stroke that you just made into the brushes panel. Call it a pattern brush and click OK. I'm getting this error that the selected artwork contains an element that cannot be used in a pattern brush, and I think that's because this stroke has this pattern fill left over that's in it, and obviously there is no fill being represented here because it's just a straight line, but it can't make a pattern brush out of something that has a pattern fill in it. So I'm just going to remove the fill there and then try this again. Drag it in there, pattern brush, okay. And now it gives me these options for how I create my pattern. So right now it's using the hash mark for the straight line segments, and that's just fine with me. I don't need any other sort of line segments, but you could define whole separate patterns for corners, both inside and outside, endpoints and arrows. It's fine with me that it has 0% spacing, so it will just start the next hash right at the end of the first one, and I'll just click OK. And now when I draw a line here, I can just come over and select that pattern brush, and it will draw that brush along the length of the line.